the central bank celebrates 65 years, which is not a short time period when you think about it. It's almost as old as the country. This institution was set up in 1950 by John Exter, an American who came from the New York Fed, and the legislation which he crafted at that time has proved remarkably resilient when you consider that even the latest constitution that we have has been amended how many, 19 times. The Monetary Law Act remains reasonably intact, and that I think is proof or testament to the foresightedness of Mr. Exter and several other people at the time who, after independence, formed this institution. So the central bank hopefully goes from strength to strength, but I won't really dwell on that too much because we're extremely delighted to have as our guest speaker today Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who I think needs no introduction, but nevertheless I feel that I should say a few words about him. First of all, when I was appointed governor in January, I found that we had to pay lots of loans, and the foreign reserves of the country were under a bit of pressure. And I lifted the phone and I called up Mumbai, and I asked Dr. Rajan, whether he could give me a helping hand. And I'm glad to say that in a record time of about 3 or 4 months, he had given us $1.5 billion in a swap facility, which helped us no end in terms of stabilizing the currency market and indeed all the financial markets in Sri Lanka, and registered our sort of stability to the rest of the world, pronounced it. So thank you very much, Raghuram. That was very, very kind of you, and we owe you in no small measure a debt of gratitude. So Raghuram was born in '63. By the way, he's also an old royalist, which is I think proof of his good intention to Sri Lanka. So Raghuram was born in '63 in Bhopal. His father was, and this is interesting, his father was a senior officer in the Intelligence Bureau. Raghuram, when he spoke to me last night, very euphemistically said that his father worked in the Indian High Commission in Colombo, but he never told me about his Intelligence Bureau part. So, his dad was obviously a spook. I'm inferring this, and this is mind you on Wikipedia, so it's publicly available. So he did his schooling in Delhi Public School, R.K. Puram, graduated from the IIT Delhi, and he got a gold medal, and then he went on to IIM Ahmedabad. So, creme de la creme of India, for those of you who know the Indian system. IIT, IIM, it doesn't get any better, but it does get better actually. So after winning the Director's Gold Medal at IIT Delhi and being a gold medalist at IIM Ahmedabad, he received a PhD in management from the MIT Sloan School of Management in '91 for his thesis entitled, and this is wonderful, Essays on Banking, his PhD thesis. After graduation, he joined the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. He was chief economist at the IMF from October '03 to December '06, and thereafter he basically helped the government of India. He replaced Kaushik Basu as chief economic advisor on the 10th of August 2012, and he became RBI governor thereafter in 2013. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the beautiful Radhika Puri, Raghuram's spouse, who is over there. She is a classmate of his from IIM Ahmedabad, now a lecturer in law at the University of Chicago Law School. They have a daughter and a son, and there's a lot more I can tell you about Raghuram, but I think I'll leave it to him to regale you with some of his wisdom. Thank you very much. Welcome, Raghuram.
Thank you very much, Governor. From the detailed investigation you've done, maybe you should have a different profession. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this most beautiful country. As the governor said, I have been here before. 46 years ago, I spent a couple of years here as a child. Father was in the Indian High Commission. And we lived on 65 by 12 Park Street. I've tried to look for that. I can't find it anymore. That reflects the progress in this country. It's probably been demolished for something else. Our neighbors at that time were a Mr. and Mrs. Vijayaratna and their children, 5 of them. I guess this reflects the times: Sunimal, Dharini, Nalin, Dayanta, and Bundi. Now, they were very good friends, and I was trying to think about what we learned. And I remember one of the things they taught us was the word bloody. I don't know if bloody is used a lot in Sri Lanka, but we used it a lot then, to the horror of our parents. And immediate chastisement followed. But reflecting on those times, the word bloody is probably thought of as Queen's English today compared to what our children use. So it was a much more gentler and civilized time. I went to Royal Junior School, and again, the one thing I remember from that is St. Thomas Paripu. I certainly had a very enjoyable time when I was here, and made a couple of visits since, and they've been fantastic. I think the ties between our two countries have strengthened over the years. Lots of sources of cooperation, both visible and less visible. And I think over time we have to build on the strengthening political ties by increasing the various areas of connection between our countries, whether it be through trade, cultural, or educational. And I think visits like this, again, made possible through the kind offices of the central bank, help. Let me start by congratulating Governor Mahendran and his colleagues on the 65th anniversary of the central bank. In most countries, 65 is when you start collecting a pension. But I suspect Sri Lanka is not ready to pension off its central bank. You need it to start its second innings. And in fact, over time, the role of the central bank has become immeasurably more than it used to be in the past. And perhaps one could argue it may have become excessive. And so today what I want to do is talk a little bit about the global environment and talk about the role of central banks there, and perhaps suggest that we central bankers need to figure out what the appropriate role we should play is, and in some cases pull back from what we've been trying to do. So let me start first with an obvious point. Growth around the world is still weak. 7-8 years after a really devastating crisis, we still find that growth hasn't picked up, so much so that the US job numbers came out last week. Again, looks like things have gone back. At the same time as growth has been weak, and unusually so after the kind of crisis that we saw, there's tremendous pressure for growth in different countries. In industrial countries, the middle class, which has been losing jobs, which has been losing good jobs, to the forces of technology, to the forces of competition from across the world, basically want more growth, to see those jobs return. But in emerging markets also, some of us with populations that are growing old before we grow rich, also we want jobs, we want growth. And I would argue this environment where there's a tremendous pressure for growth, the traditional avenues for growth aren't playing out as they've done in the past. And I'll talk a little more about that and why that will be the case. As a result, everybody looks to the central banks. Why don't you produce some more growth for us? Now, of course, central banks can do a little bit of it, But beyond a certain point, the kind of growth we can produce is very short term, perhaps comes at the expense of our own long-term growth, and perhaps comes at the expense of growth in other countries. And I'll talk about that a little more. So what I will argue is that we are in a dangerous phase in the global economy, where instead of perhaps investing the political capital to do what is necessary, we're relying on central banks to bail us out. But this has not worked in the past, and it probably will not work again. And if that is where we put our effort, we're likely to remain in this phase of slow growth for a much longer period, and that itself creates strange and unpleasant political dynamics, which has adverse effects on the system in the long run. So that's where I'm going to go. I'll see if I can talk a little bit about solutions. But let's start first with why have we got this slow growth? Before the crisis, you can think of the emerging markets. I know every emerging market is different, but emerging markets largely exporting to China and China exporting to the industrial world. That's a very simplified and simplistic, perhaps, view of what was going on. But the industrial countries had tremendous demand, and China helped feeding the emerging market demand into the emerging market supply into the industrial country demand. The problem was the industrial country demand was built on shaky foundations. In the US, it was private debt. In Greece, it was public debt. In a number of other countries, there was unsustainable growth built on very low interest rates, excess spending, and debt buildup. Eventually, that came to an end. It came to an end in three different crises, or three different periods of stress, I should say. First period of stress was the subprime crisis in the US, 2007-2008. Created a near meltdown of the global financial system, but the Federal Reserve intervened appropriately at the right time and preserved it. I think that would be seen as Chairman Bernanke's singular great achievement of preserving the financial system intact. But the crisis spread from the US to Europe, where it was a full-fledged euro area crisis. Remember 2011, 2012, weekly meetings when the end of the euro was being contemplated, and again these weekend meetings preserved the system. But now the crisis has moved on. It has moved now to the emerging markets. China is very much in focus with the very high debt levels that have built up post-crisis, but one should not ignore what has been happening in Brazil, what is happening in South Africa, what is happening in many parts of the world, where leverage built up post-crisis this time is now affecting the growth of these economies. So we've had a series of sort of staggered periods of stress, the latest being in the emerging markets. The question is, how do we get out of it? Well, we've tried the traditional stimulus, the fiscal stimulus, to some extent the monetary stimulus. I'll come to that in a moment. But they haven't had the force that is necessary to pull economies out of trouble. In some economies, there's not enough spending capacity left with the government because it's highly indebted. Some of the governments in Europe with debt to GDP over 100%. Japan today with debt to GDP over 200%. These are countries that reflect the lack of fiscal space. But also, when you're confronted with a very big crisis where the private sector is unwilling to spend because it's highly levered, households don't want to spend more because they've taken on too much debt to buy houses that have collapsed in price. When you have that kind of situation, you need a tremendous amount of spending by the government to offset that. And what the traditional Keynesian doesn't fully realize is governments aren't equipped to spend that amount of money quickly in such a big way. You simply, spending money takes time to develop good projects, to see them through, to monitor them, etc. If you suddenly throw a whole lot of money at a government department, all the projects that have been shelved in the past because they are unviable suddenly surface. Because it's too problematic to look for new viable projects. You just don't have the time. So spending then goes on things like high-speed railways, which take a lot of money, seem fun and exciting and innovative, but don't really, in many cases, fit the needs of the country. High-speed rail is for very specific purposes, not really for the average country. So the point is fiscal stimulus, very little fiscal space, also doesn't go in the right direction, and it's hard to do in enough quantity to revive an economy. Monetary stimulus is, I'll come to again, also has limitations. But one of the thoughts that people have had is, maybe the problem is not just fiscal or monetary stimulus. Maybe there are real problems in the global economy which need to be fixed. So, for example, with the emerging markets, many of us had an export-led strategy which was feeding demand in industrial countries. Well, with the industrial countries slowing down, where's the demand going to be? You've got to refocus on new sources of demand, often which are to be found domestically. This is something that China, for example, is trying to do. Instead of an export-led growth strategy, can we produce our own demand? Can we generate our own demand, increase consumption levels in the economy? But we also have to ask, why is it that industrial country demand is not revving up, even so many years after a crisis? Why is it that people aren't spending more? Why is it that demand in the world seems relatively weak? There are a number of explanations for this. One set of explanations has to do with aging populations demanding less and growing income inequality. Of course, if you're relatively poor, you spend any additional income you have on anything because there's so much you want. But if you're relatively rich and you get more income, then you're not really going to spend it on anything because there's not so much you want that you're desperate for. So the marginal propensity to spend for the rich is much lower than for the poor. So if you have growing income inequality, demand sometimes tends to follow. So aging and income inequality often are seen as the culprits for why demand is slowing down in aging industrial populations. But there's also a school of thought which is saying it's not just about the demand, it's about the world changing in terms of things like innovation. Innovation is less effective today in increasing productivity than it used to be in the past. Now you may say, can anybody be saying something like this? In this world we have such great innovations every day, some new computer application, the iPad, the iPhone, such wonderful things have made life so much more different than in the past. Hasn't this innovation been really good? How can you say that innovation hasn't helped? Well, one school of thought basically says, yes, this is all very good, but compare these to the innovations in the early 1910s, 1920s. At that time, you replaced the horse-drawn carriage with a motor car. You replaced the ship, which was the sailing ship, with the steamship and then the diesel-fueled ship. You replaced, mail, physical mail, letters, with the telegraph and then with the telephone. So compare those advances with perhaps replacing email with Twitter. Are those two really comparable? You move from a horse-drawn carriage to a motor car, which changes everything. You move from going in ships to going by airplane, which changes everything. And you go from sending email to sending 140 characters on Twitter. Not a big deal, it's just a different form of communication. So the point really that some people are making is, yes, we have innovation, but it's not of the same quality that we had in the past, and therefore you don't see the big innovations in productivity. Productivity is slowing, the supply side is slowing. Whatever the reason, demand slowing, supply slowing, world growth slowing has to be compensated somehow. And The answer that every economist knows when these things happen is we need reforms. What are called structural reforms, reforms that increase competition, reforms that increase the incentive to innovate, reforms that increase productivity. Structural reforms are what every country needs. But unfortunately, structural reforms are the hardest thing to do because they have the strong timing of pain and gain. What the political establishment often likes is where the gain comes up front and the pain is way down the line, right? With due apologies to our minister here. What the fact of structural reforms is the pain comes up front and the gain is down the line. And this led Jean-Claude Juncker from Luxembourg to say, when he was talking about European structural reforms, we all know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we do it. So, structural reforms in country after country in the West have been put on a shelf. Serious structural reforms. Some under the stress of debt are doing it. Spain did a lot of reforms in the last few years and has come back to strong growth. But many would like to put it on the shelf. So, fiscal stimulus is not possible. Monetary stimulus, diminishing returns, I'll talk about it. And you can't do structural reforms. Where can you find growth? Number of countries have said, well, maybe we should find growth by exporting to the emerging markets. This was when the emerging markets were growing strongly. But of course, the emerging markets are also desperate for growth. If they buy other people's products, their growth is going to be relatively slower. Better to export to the other countries and increase your own growth, right? But also there's a history of emerging markets absorbing other countries' products in a big way. It happened in the 1990s when the Asian countries ran large current account deficits, imported a lot in order to build massive highways, railways, etc. But found eventually that if you import a lot and run a large current account deficit, it becomes difficult to finance it at some point. You have credit booms, you have fiscal spending going haywire, and at some point financiers say, I don't trust your country anymore, and the money dries up. And when the money dries up, you have a crisis which negates all the many years of solid investment and growth that you had. A number of countries that went through the Asian crisis discovered that. And what you see in the recent build-up of investment post-great financial crisis is a similar pattern. That the emerging markets ran larger current account deficits, or at least lower surpluses. The industrial countries ran larger surpluses, but the emerging markets, one after the other, are finding difficulties in doing this, especially as they deal with the hot money inflows that came in to finance this kind of activity. So what we have is really no easy way for growth. There is a way to grow, which is through structural reforms, but that's politically difficult. And fiscal doesn't work. An export-led strategy maybe, but everybody wants to export. And this is where monetary policy becomes the savior of first and last resort. In industrial countries, monetary policy has brought down interest rates down to zero, effectively. This has had two very important effects. One effect is, of course, that by bringing interest rates to zero, you hope that people who want to borrow will borrow and spend, and that will increase growth. Unfortunately, people who could borrow and spend, borrowed and spent the previous time, and are now in crisis. They have houses they can't afford, they have high debt loads they can't pay down. So if you reduce interest rates and make it easier to borrow, they don't really want to borrow, they don't spend. So that channel doesn't work. What does work is with low interest rates, asset prices boom. Your bond prices go through the roof, your stock prices go through the roof. You've engineered a financial expansion. And that's what we see around the world. Financial assets are priced very, very well and have benefited from this boom. That has a small effect on people's spending. People feel wealthier, they will go and spend, but most of the people who hold financial assets are the very rich, across countries who really are already spending what they can. The second effect, however, has been the more important effect. As you reduce interest rates, as you move into more exotic kinds of monetary intervention like quantitative easing or QQE and so on, you have an effect on the exchange rate. Your exchange rate starts depreciating. And because your exchange rate starts depreciating, that export market that you were thinking about becomes a little more real. You start exporting your way out of trouble. And I would argue this has been the way that the industrial countries have benefited a little from the easy monetary policy over the last few years. It has kept the exchange rate down relative to the currency of the emerging markets. But this, in fact, has had the opposite effect for the emerging markets. The emerging markets have been less able to export, and as a result, their growth has slowed down, which is why we are now in the situation of the third leg of the crisis, the emerging markets in trouble, why the crisis has migrated from the industrial countries to the emerging markets. Now, is this fair? Is it fair to export your way out of trouble? Is it fair to depreciate your exchange rate and to essentially manipulate the global financial system? We have rules of the game in the global financial system which are meant to prevent this kind of strategy. It was known as beggar thy neighbor strategy in the 1930s because of the harm it did to your neighbors. You benefited at the expense of your neighbors, but then if everybody did it, nobody benefited. And the question is this a fair strategy? And the answer is, we don't have any rules against it. If you depreciate your exchange rate in the global financial system by very aggressive monetary policy that doesn't increase your own demand because your interest rate sensitive sectors are not working, they're not responsive to the low interest rates, but your exchange rate depreciates, this is okay. This is feasible in the global financial system today. There are no rules against it. Of course, if you intervene directly in your exchange rate and try and weaken it, you sell dollars and try and weaken your exchange rate, that's not, if you buy dollars and weaken your exchange rate, that's not allowed, okay? But you can, what you can do is use extremely accommodative monetary policy to push for your exports to grow. Now today, we are in an environment where all the industrial country central banks have gone full hog on monetary policy. So much so that any country exiting from this set of policies suddenly faces an immediate appreciation of its currency. You saw that with the dollar. As there was an anticipation that the US might exit the very accommodative monetary policies it had, suddenly the dollar started shooting up, which had effects on US exports, which had effects on US growth, and soon you find the US Fed says, well, maybe not now. We'll wait a little bit before we start raising interest rates. So we have two problems today. One, that monetary policy has become the only game in town, and the way it works is through a strategy which might have more of a bigger than neighbor character than it used to have in the past. So that is one problem. Second problem is, it's getting very hard to get out, because the country that gets out faces a tremendous appreciation in its exchange rate, which can then set back growth quite a bit. So what this calls for, in a sense, is a coordinated strategy of getting out. But given that different countries are at different stages of the recovery, that coordinated strategy cannot happen. The problem is, if we continue along this path for a sustained period, we get a whole set of new problems. With interest rates as low as they are, asset prices will grow significantly more, debt will pile on significantly more, and we recreate the conditions that led to the global financial crisis. We have frothy areas of the economy where prices go out of kilter, housing is picking up across the world. These are sources of concern. Not yet sources of crisis, but certainly sources of concern. So I'm going to end here, and having sort of laid out the problem and saying we are in a difficult situation across the world. Not entirely because central bankers have done it, but because the other tools haven't been employed. And as a result, pressure has fallen on central bankers to do something, to do anything. And the way they've responded has created an equilibrium across the world, which makes it very difficult to get out. A Chakravyuh, so to speak, of an economist, a prisoner's dilemma situation. How do we get out of all this? How do we get out of it? Well, we need a few central bankers who are bold enough to say, okay, I'll take the exchange rate risk. I will take the exchange rate hit as I come out of these accommodative policies, and that will help other countries also get out, and we will come out of this altogether. But in an environment where growth is so weak and we're desperate for every little bit of extra growth that we can get, it's hard to see any central banker being able to do this and surviving the political heat that would come if in fact they're willing to accept slower growth of their economies. So it is a difficult situation. I have been emphasizing the need for new rules of the game in the global financial system. New rules of the game which recognize these kinds of problems in central banking and the fact that we need to have ways of ruling out monetary policies which are overly aggressive and have more of an adverse external impact much greater than any beneficial domestic impact or beneficial global impact. We also need to think about safety nets. We need to think if these kinds of policies do happen across the world, they create tremendous financial market volatility. You've seen before the Fed announcement in September, financial markets became significantly volatile, anticipating the end of these policies. I have no doubt when the Fed again looks like it will exit, financial markets will again become volatile. Now, how do you protect against such volatility if you're an emerging market? Well, there seem to be only two options. One, build extensive reserve hoards of your own, which have a lot of implications for global demand. And two, try and put yourself at the center of a variety of swap arrangements with other central banks so that you can call on global reserves if need be, if in times of difficulty. Now, countries are following a mix of both approaches, but is this the best way to go forward? Should we have a better agreement, first, on the kinds of policies that create these kinds of fragilities, and second, on a global multilateral safety net, which therefore makes it less important for every country to scramble to find friends in the global economy who will create the kinds of safety nets for it that are needed. We've looked around, we have swap arrangements with Sri Lanka, with Japan. Every other country is scrambling around to do these kinds of things. But ultimately what we want is a better global system where these kinds of safety nets are in fact provided for everybody without people having to scramble around looking for their own. Let me end here and say there is a lot of scope for improvement of the global financial system. The fortunate thing for countries like mine, and I would presume like Sri Lanka, is we still have traditional central banking to do. Development central banking, where we still have reasonable inflation rates. So we're not very much in the kinds of problems that I talked about that industrial countries are in. We only have to react to those kinds of policies rather than being subject to the same kind of trap. We essentially, I think, are still in the game of doing good as opposed to avoiding doing harm, which I think industrial countries central banks are. But I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open to questions. Governor Mr. Arjuna Mahindran will chair the session. Please do make use of the floating microphones available across the hall for effective interaction.
So, plenty of food for thought there. Any questions? Dr. Veera Singh, over here.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. I'm Untitled Deputy Governor. So, we talked about the global safety net. I think one of the solutions obviously the IMF, and also now the issue is that increasing quota has not been worked out yet. That is one of the solutions, as you know. And other ones basically the Chinese IIB and then BRIC Bank. What do you think that BRIC Bank, like other similar institutions somewhere else, do you think that would be the way forward? What are the things that this institution can play the role unless if the IMF is willing to reform itself, and what are the roles of other institutions like the multilateral ones? Thank you.
Yes, why don't you use that mic?
Okay. That's a very good question. I think the ideal would be a robust multilateral safety net. And clearly the IMF seems the natural entity to provide such a safety net. It could take the form of central bank swaps mediated by the IMF, for example. The problem to some extent is that going to the IMF is problematic because of the historical stigmas associated with going to the IMF. So even if the IMF had the resources, I think a number of countries would still find it difficult to approach the IMF for a swap arrangement, because that would signal or that would be sort of used perhaps politically as you can't manage your own finances, you're going to a multilateral organization. But if we can get rid of the stigma issue somehow, I think that would be the first best approach, having a strong multilateral safety net. I think the regional safety nets, the BRICS Bank, the various other, it's the CRA that we've signed, those I think are second best arrangements because they're a small group of countries, many of whom could be affected by the same shocks. So you ask a country to help its co-signatory at a time when they may be affected by the same kind of concerns. But still, to the extent it puts pressure on the international organizations to change, I think the second best approach is also a reasonable one. In the long run, we have to work for reform of the multilateral organizations such that they can do the right thing by their constituents.
Thank you. Questions? Harsha, I know you're bursting to ask a question. The mic, please, for Dr. Nitya.
Thank you. The two words that I've been thinking about is prisoner's dilemma. And that's kind of what you said. So, I mean, sort of a game theoretic approach to get out of the prisoner's dilemma. Do we cooperate or do we beggar thy neighbor? Are we willing to take everybody along with us? How practical is that? How will IMF really mediate bilateral, multilateral swaps? Is it practical? Theoretically possible though? So I kind of find your talk not only extremely thought-provoking, but also a bit scary. Your thoughts?
So I think you're absolutely right. I am worried. Scared would be, I think, excessive for me. But I'm worried that about two aspects. One is, I don't think we still fully understand why growth is so slow. So many years after the crisis, we don't understand it. I gave some possibilities, but for every possibility I give, there's a counter possibility, right? And so we don't understand why the world is not growing faster. That's one. But second, even whatever growth there is, with the US growing as fast as it was, there was a sense that the US would now come out of these easy monetary policies, and that would be beneficial for some of the other countries, because as the US exchange rate appreciated, the US would draw in goods from other countries and drag them along. It would be the locomotive for the world. But this hasn't played out, partly because the US Fed wants to see stronger sustainable growth before it starts raising interest rates. But that also means that other countries, seeing the US is backing off, are now expanding on their existing policies even more. I mean, the euro area has been talking about expanding QE in a stronger way, and there is a lot of anticipation that Japan will do more. And of course, a lot of people are debating why China moved. But clearly, one of the reasons it moved was exports were not as strong as it would have desired. So in this environment of, as you said, the prisoner's dilemma, with each central bank having a domestic mandate, no central bank is asked to look for the world. It has to look for domestic growth. So none of them really has an incentive to go first and to start coming out of this era of easy policy. And the longer we have easy policy, the more detrimental it becomes, because prices are distorted, and when the change eventually comes, there'll be a big reaction in financial markets. So I'm hopeful that the data will be strong enough in the US for the US to emerge. That's the economy that seems most likely to emerge. But everybody thought September, now the betting is March. No, I think the multilateral agencies were meant for this kind of coordination. But the multilateral agencies, the IMF, for example, has played a very, very passive role here, essentially applauding all the monetary moves by everybody. It hasn't been discriminating and saying this is a good move, that is not a good move. It's basically blessed. I'm sure there's an IMF representative here. But this is a criticism I've made in Washington also, that there has not been a single aggressive monetary policy move that the IMF has not liked. It's okay in this world of weak demand. But if the weak demand is taking from each other rather than adding, I think there's an issue.
Last question.
Dr. Rajan, if I may ask you the micro-level question, Dr. Rajan. You talked about government expenditure being sometimes a good thing, but it has to be a focused type of spending. You also talked about railways, high-speed railways not being an appropriate expenditure. But yet, recently the central bank thought the import bills on vehicles was too high for the country, and to curtail that, maybe the only option is railway. Maybe not highway, not high speed, but could be public transportation and railway. How would you advise this country to go ahead at this kind of juncture with regard to reducing our import bills on vehicles and so forth?
See, far be it for me, a visitor of 3 days, to advise a country on what it should do. But my point about high-speed rail was actually quite a simple point. It is that everybody thinks that's the next step from moderate speed rail. Let's go to high-speed rail. And some countries have pulled it off. China seems to be pulling it off. But of course, one wants to look at the whole economics of whether they're able to generate adequate revenue. But the issue with high-speed rail is, even though it sounds very interesting, it requires certain basic economics. It has to be between two highly populated cities with no stops in the middle. No stops, because that's the only way the high speed actually pays off. Otherwise, if you have stops at every place, it becomes a commuter rail and therefore not very effective. Now, what happens in a number of places is they haven't thought through this. You need two highly populated cities, not two low populated cities connected. And second, every time this gets put in, there's a lot of community pressure to have stops along the way. And once you have stops along the way, it destroys the very purpose of high-speed rail. So what you see in the US is a lot of high-speed rail was actually mooted post-financial crisis. There's yet one to actually come off since then because of all these difficulties in actually implementing it.
Okay, final question from Ettore.
Ethereal Interact, the resident representative of IMF. Since my institution was mentioned here a couple of times, I was bound to ask a question. You talked about global coordination mechanism. This could be a complement or some kind of mechanism of central bank swaps that could be facilitated by a global institution. But will it be a permanent and durable solution to a problem? And let me give you a content to this question. One of the main reasons when you described prisoner dilemma was countries' unwillingness to address structural reforms. And this unwillingness comes from political palatability or feasibility, difficult reforms that need to be implemented. So delaying those reforms basically puts central banks into a position to find not permanent, but temporary solutions to a problem. So you did, within your capacity, the best to address the problem, but it's not a solution to the core of the issue. It's just kind of a delaying structural and painful reform. Now you are kind of elevating it to the global scale. So now there is this global coordination mechanism, and you are not alone in the game. There is somebody else who could help you. But in many respects, that's just another layer of delaying structural reforms. So sure, it could save some time, and maybe better times come and structural reforms going to be addressed. But it comes back to the global coordination mechanism. Global coordination mechanism without structural reforms, not going to be a durable mechanism. And then you go back to the stigma issue again, because if IMF comes in, they will ask for structural reforms, and those reforms may not be politically palatable. So again, global coordination mechanism is a good response and temporary solution, but it may not be a durable solution because you need structural reforms. And those structural reforms cannot be imposed on a country. So some things internally need to be decided.
Again, a very good question. That's why I put central bankers at the center of this. Clearly, structural reforms are needed, but as you've said and as I argued, politically difficult. Now, the question is, should central bankers then do what they can, given this is not happening? And there are two schools of thought here. One is saying yes, because then otherwise the economy will plunge into a desperate situation. And the second is no, because if they do a little bit but don't go beyond that, then there's some hope that the structural reforms eventually will happen when things get really tough, that everybody has to bite the bullet. So that's really the debate, whether in doing, in arguing they always have ammunition. And unfortunately, the nature of central banking means that you have to say you always have ammunition, even when you don't. Because otherwise it would mean recognizing that you could have deflation, you could not meet your inflation target and things like that. You're not allowed to say that. So as a result, the central banker always has something else up his sleeve in order to produce when the political establishment doesn't produce the structural reforms. But aggregate that across countries and you have the kind of prisoner's dilemma situation I talked about. I think a separate issue, I think you could almost separate them, is the issue of safety nets. The safety nets are really for the recipients of this kind of monetary policy, I wouldn't say just the emerging markets, but the Switzerland's, of the world as well as the emerging markets. That is it possible to sort of build a safety net for them such that they don't have to aggressively build their own reserves, or individually try and enter into swap arrangements with others so as to. There I think one could make more progress, even without addressing the earlier problem of the domestic mandate of central banks and them going too far on that.
Governor Rajan, you are flanked by two of the most popular politicians in Colombo, and Jiva wants to also ask you a question. I think given that politicians, to use Mr. Juncker's phrase, are worried about being re-elected, perhaps Jiva can enlighten us on how he's planning to do that. With structural reform.
But Doctor, it's about the interest rates. Should a country go by artificial interest rates set by the banks, or from my little experience I have in business, I think the natural interest rates on supply and demand, and even the foreign currency rates, should it be natural, or the central bank should get involved and set artificial rates for them? And I would think having a natural on supply and demand is for you to find the country to know where you exactly are, rather than setting up artificial rates. What's your view on this?
Well, this is a deep, deep question which goes to Austrian school and all that they think about the natural rate. Let me put it quite as yes, interest rates in a country are determined by the supply of savings. You need to give savers an adequate interest rate for them to save, as well as the demand for savings from the borrowers. The interest rate has to be low enough for them to borrow and invest, right? So absolutely, and to some extent, central banking is about trying to figure out where that interest rate is, because nobody ever tells you that. And if you set the rate way below that, you get excess demand and you get a lot of credit growth, current account deficits. You set it way above that, you get a lot of savings, current account surpluses, and so on. I think we're all battling to find out where that rate is. But there is also, to my mind, a kind of equilibrium that economists haven't thought about enough, where the central bank and the market equilibrium are chasing each other down. Where we think, oh, the market is not willing to supply this amount of credit demand at this particular interest rate, let's push it down so that somebody will go out and borrow. But people aren't going to be willing to borrow even at the lower interest rate. So we set it even further down. We go as far as possible, and yet we can't generate the growth. And it may be sometimes that the equilibrium is actually up there. So we push it so far down that nothing actually happens. It's a possibility. But nevertheless, I think in this kind of environment, where we've had low interest rates for a long, long time, we have to ask ourselves, is this actually positive in any way? Or should we be returning to some kind of, maybe not 5-6%, but at least 1 or 2%, as opposed to negative 0.75 in some countries?
What a wonderful answer. Sanjeev, now you know why we can't cut interest rates in Sri Lanka. Okay, so thank you very much, Raghuram Rajan. I really want to thank you very deeply for your presence here today. And I'd like to give you a small token of our appreciation, if you don't mind. Interesting, you hope to have. You know, this hopefully is the first of several such events which we at the Central Bank will be providing in the months and years ahead. So thank you once again, and see you soon.